Hi, my name is Andrigo Noella. Welcome back to the Burn Bag Podcast. America is in the grip of a new and dangerous era, an era of violent populism, as my next guest will say. The assassination of conservative activist Charlie Kirk isn't an isolated act. It's the latest flashpoint in a wave of political violence that's ripping through our democracy today. In 2025 alone, the United States has seen over 150 politically motivated attacks, nearly double the pace of last year. And across party lines, public support for using violence to achieve political goals is rising to historic levels. We've had a long list of violent incidents. June 2025, a man posing as a police officer assassinated Minnesota Representative Melissa Hortman and wounded Senator John Hoffman. April 2025, a Molotov cocktail attack on Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro's residence forced his family to flee. September 2024, a man was arrested for attempting to assassinate President Trump. July of 2024, someone actually wounded President Trump in a shooting and killed a rally goer in Pennsylvania. October 2022, a man broke into Nancy Pelosi's home and fractured her husband's skull with a hammer. June of 2022, a California man traveled to Maryland intending to assassinate Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh. January 2021, of course, was the January 6th attacks. In October 2020, 14 men plotted to kidnap Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer. These aren't just isolated tragedies, they're signals. A society where politics is increasingly viewed as war and where opponents are not just seen as rivals, but political enemies. Today, I'm speaking with my old professor from the University of Chicago, Dr. Robert Pape, a leading expert on political violence and the director of the Chicago Project on Security and Threats. He's been ringing alarm bells for years, and now the alarms are blaring. We'll unpack what's driving this crisis, why it's escalating, and what, if anything, we can do to actually pull back from the brink. So, Professor Pape, thanks for joining me here today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Andre, for having me on. It was great having you as a student. It's wonderful to see you flourish. And your intro captured this tragic era. I created this term, violent populism, so that we could have a term for the space between civil war and the kind of nasty politics as usual that we've been used to for decades. We are in this new era of violent populism with the assassination death of Charlie Kirk, one of the most prominent leaders of the MAGA movement. We're now firmly in the grip of violent populism. It's not just congealing. And I'm sorry to say, if we leave this go on its own momentum, things will escalate. There are things we can do, but first and foremost, we need to sort of understand what's occurring.
No, absolutely. And I mean, Professor Pape, we constantly hear that we live in these unprecedented times, that both sides of the political spectrum are more violent than ever before. It depends on who you listen to, whether it's the President of the United States, liberal commentators, conservative commentators, whoever. As you said, you've described this era as an era of violent populism. But what actually defines this era? How is it different from past eras of political violence in the United States? Some people may say, hey, it was way worse in the 1960s. We had President Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, many others who were shot and killed in that decade. But why is this different? Is it worse than before?
There's really three elements here to discuss, and then let me name them, and then we can unpack them as
Yeah.
we converse. Element number one is we are in a historical period of high political violence on both the right and the left. I realize that's a contested statement, but let's just say that's element number one, high political violence on both the right and the left. Element number two is we have high levels of support for political violence in the body politic among people on the left side of the political spectrum and the right side of the political spectrum. We have tens of millions of Americans who support political violence. This is not just a handful of people under rocks. Issue number three is this is all being driven by historic social changes that are happening in our country. And we're at what I call a tipping point generation. And that's the underlying fuel that's really fueling this. So these are the three broad elements that together define this new era of violent populism. And actually, yes, the 1960s was another earlier era of most of those elements. And these are not identical. I would still call it violent populism. That was an era in the 60s where the violence was coming almost all from the left. Here was also a product of support for violence in the body politic and also a product in the 60s of social change. So it's not like history copies itself. It kind of rhymes more than you get identical. But today, we really do have those three elements here. And maybe it's up to you, Andre, how would like to do it. I think we should just talk about them each one by one.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, first of all, I mean, you mentioned that support for political violence has been rising. You actually do research on this at CPOST. I mean, what's been most alarming from the latest survey data? I mean, like,
Yeah,
why are people more supportive of political violence?
yeah, well, so let's talk about our survey. So, as you mentioned, we've been doing at the University of Chicago Project on Security and Threats quarterly surveys on support for political violence in the United States since the summer of 2021. So, we've done about 15 of them so far. In a few weeks, we'll have yet another one that's going to come out. The most recent survey we did was in May. And in May, we found the highest levels that we found in 4 years on support for political violence on both the right and the left. In our May survey, to give you an example, and you can go to our CPOST website and get all the full top line
Mhm.
findings, but just as two examples. We found that 39% of Democrats agreed that the use of force was justified to remove Donald Trump from the presidency. And that phrase, Andre, the use of force, we know from previous deeper dives, 55% of the people who say that mean assassination, lethal attack, and not just yelling. Now, what we also found in May was that 25% of Republicans agreed that the use of the US military was justified to suppress Democratic protesters. That too was pretty stunning because the US military is the most lethal force on the planet. That's not a police force. That's
Yeah.
not the National Guard. This is, gotta remember, this is the US military that we pay $1 trillion a year to make the most lethal fighting force on the planet. So these represent tens of millions on each side of the political spectrum supporting political violence. Now, we asked somewhat comparable questions a year before. They weren't exactly identical because the situation changed, but the bottom line is that these are beyond double what we saw before. So, this is one of the reasons I wrote this big op-ed in the New York Times in June saying we're on the brink of major political violence. And it's because one of the ways we know, one of our canaries in the coal mine, so to speak, are these political surveys because they give us a snapshot of what to expect in the next 2, 3, 4 months. And that's why we do them here. And that's why they're vital. And we're the ones who have done that more than anybody else in the United States, in the world. I'm very proud to be at the University of Chicago. I don't know that we could do this anywhere else, honestly. Other places are richer or whatever, but as you know, Andre, we're very attuned here to making our research really matter. We do this in economics, we do this in political science.
It's one of the reasons why I chose to go to do my master's program at the University of Chicago. So,
Yeah,
I
it's a
mean,
very unique environment, and I can't imagine doing this really anywhere else. And it's not just that we're alums and so forth. It's just the fact that if you just look at how much we have contributed in other areas, we don't just do academic research that sits on the shelf. We're always looking for that to really help make the world better.
absolutely. So, Professor Pape, digging into one of the key drivers of these terrifying trends, to be honest, you talked about social change, really demographic transformation, right? Like, I mean, that's one of the root causes here, not necessarily just the internet, not necessarily just rhetoric, but can you walk us through why demographic transformation is such a strong driver? And what exactly is this demographic transformation we're actually talking about?
Yeah, let me say this. And Andre, I'm going to explain the demographic transformation, and then I'm going to add another issue here as we talk that is
Gotcha.
not because we got a longer time on your nice podcast. So the biggest change, social change, when it happens in countries, major social change, this tends to produce political upheavals because it changes the parties that can win elections. It changes literally who's going to govern a society from what groups. It also changes the winners and losers in a country. So when you have major social change in a country, it is common for that to radicalize politics and then to lead to political violence. It's not the only cause of political violence, but it's a big one. Well, the big social change that's happening in America now is we're shifting for the first time in our country's 250-year history from a white majority democracy to a white minority democracy. We in 1990 were about 76% non-Hispanic white as a population. Today, that's 57% non-Hispanic white, and it will be another 10 years, maybe 15, depending on the millions of deportations we have, before we'll become a white minority democracy. Now, that is not the only factor going on, but this is the taproot that helps to explain the meteoric rise of Donald Trump 10 years ago on the signature issue of immigration. Why immigration could morph from being stop people coming in to deport mass numbers, even if it means wrecking the economy. I mean, really quite big issue here. Basically, what's happening here as this issue radicalizes our politics is that you have people, not everybody who voted for Trump by any stretch, but you have people on the right who see this change and they'd like to stop it or reverse it. And you have other people on the left, not everybody who voted for Biden or Kamala Harris fits this bill, but a lot, who want to accelerate that, open borders, you see, let this happen faster. And these two forces are at odds with each other. And that's one of the big reasons why we're having radical politics over the issue of immigration. And it's getting worse, not getting better. You might think, oh, we stopped the border, right? We froze the border. This could calm down. Well, no, because these underlying demographics are still occurring. And that's one of the big factors. And again, this will go on for about another 10 or 15 years to play itself out here. And this is one of the reasons things are just getting worse.
Yeah, yeah, no. I mean, when you look at it through the lens of immigration, I think when you point out that fact, right, that this country is in a transition going from a white majority democracy to a white minority democracy, added in with a lot of the hot rhetoric around immigration, it's easy to see how that can, I guess, stir people up and then almost sort of causes zigzag, right? Like one will commit an act of violent, populism, for example, and then the other side may then retaliate, often in the form of lone wolves and so on. But I mean,
And it's also, Andre, why there are large groups on both sides of the political spectrum that feel disrespected. So the identity issue.
mhm,
You have whites who feel disrespected for being whites. You have non-whites who feel disrespected who are because they're non-white. That is minorities. And they're both happening at the same time. You see what I mean? So you're getting this idea of the two sides. You sort of see this over the weekend with what happened on Friday. We had a vote in Congress in the House,
yeah,
a bill to condemn political violence, but also to glorify Charlie Kirk. And that turned out to produce about 100 Democrats voted with the Republicans, but about 100 did not, and 50 of them literally voted no. And some of them came on, and CNN, Ilhan Omar, on Friday night, talked about why. And she said, well, she felt that Kirk disrespected her. And she gives all her reasons. Now, that very much angered people on the other side. because literally that then provoked the counter reaction because on the other side, people felt Omar was disrespecting Kirk. So and also disrespecting, therefore, what Kirk represented, which was in some ways a defense of many people who were traditional Americans, as he would call them. So what you ended up with within the space of just the couple of last days, a little microcosm of this example of how you could take this demographic shift, which seems very like it's in numbers and the census and it doesn't matter. Okay. And what you see is it comes right and touches people in their personal life, in who they are. And that's one of the things that's really happening in our country. But there's a second thing, Andre, that's happening. And I'll be writing more about the second thing, but I want to kind of give you an early heads up
Sure.
on that. Okay. Which is side by side with this demographic shift. Since the 1980s to now, we've seen a massive wealth shift from the bottom 90% of the country to the top 1% of the country. Now, to be really clear, what's shifting? We all know something's shifting to the top 1%. It's about seven, it's about a third. They're getting about a third wealthier than they were. But where is that coming from? It's not coming from the top, the 90 percentile to the 99th percentile. They've been flat over that 40-year period. It's all coming out of the bottom 90% of society who didn't have that much to begin with, you see. So what's happening is we are living economically in what I'm now going to call in future writing a negative sum society, where increasingly 90% of the public is scrambling harder and harder for a lot less and going at each other. Now, these two trends, that is, the white demographic shift and the negative sum society economically, for 90% of Americans, are interacting in incredibly poisonous ways. So just taking race, for example, there is no doubt, if you look at the data, that Black Americans are better off economically today than they were 40 years ago, but they're nowhere near catching up to that top 90th percent. They're not even close. Okay. There is not just a glass ceiling, it's a concrete ceiling the way they see it. At the same time, over that last 40 years, white Americans are losing dramatically, especially if they don't have a college degree. And so what you're getting is economically, fewer and fewer people have a stake in the system. That's why you're hearing that they're sort of anger at from both sides of the aisle on the elites who are increasingly running. Because what's happening is the top 1% is getting richer and richer. The bottom 90% is getting poorer and poorer. And increasingly then they can't come together. They can agree the system isn't worth saving, but they can't really, they're having a hard time coming to agreement, you see. So you put these two forces together, the social change and the economic change. Oh my goodness. I mean, these are really wicked problems that we're facing. And neither political party is seriously talking about changing this because they all have their donors. You see what I mean? So
Also, that
neither political party is
yeah.
actually serious about, you can't say, oh, that's those bad Republicans. That's what the Democrats are trying to say. It's those bad Republicans who won't do, no. You've had the Democratic control of the White House and the Congress for a lot of years. They haven't done jack. Okay. So this is really, these wicked problems here have been going on for decades. Now everything's coming together, and that's why this is really not going to be easy to change over the next 10 years. This isn't just a Donald Trump problem. This isn't just a social media. Social media makes this worse. Some of the political
Yeah,
leaders
that's what I
make
was
it
going to
worse.
ask.
Yeah. So
The
this is
anonymity of social media, like, I mean, like when I'm looking at all of these news events, right, and I'm seeing all the comments, like
yeah,
you referenced the Ilhan Omar
yeah.
comments right after that on X. I saw plenty of extreme rhetoric. I saw a lot of extreme rhetoric after Charlie Kirk's assassination. People going for, saying this is going to be the start of civil war. We're going to go after the other side in violent means, very implicitly. And I always thought, like, okay, maybe it's the anonymity of all these people behind the screen where it becomes a lot easier to say these things and you're in an echo chamber and therefore you get radicalized. But what I'm hearing from you is not so much.
Well, no, it's not that what you're seeing is wrong. It's only partial, though. So in
Gotcha.
our survey, see, we're doing more than scrolling through X, right? So you're scrolling through and you're seeing this, and that's what you're also seeing in the podcast world. They're basically all
That's
scrolling
what
through X.
scares me.
Okay. But we're doing in our national surveys, we've asked questions about where do you consume your news? How much time do you spend on social media? And what you see is that the pools of people who are supporting political violence, it's true, the more time they spend on social media, if they're really spending 8 hours a day on social media, that will be more likely to support political violence. But it's such a small fraction of the overall pool of supporters of violence that you could take them away and you're taking away 10, 15, 20% of the cake. You're not taking away the 80% because the 80% are basically in the mainstream. They're in the mainstream. They're not just 20 years old, okay? They're 30, 40, 55, okay? That's like what happened on Capitol Hill. The storm that was the storm was made by 41-year-olds, not 20-year-olds. And so the what you see is that the pie here or the cake is 80% people who watch Fox News or
Mhm.
MSNBC or CNN or NPR or the New York Times. And now you say, well, wait a minute, why, how could that be? Well, the next thing to note is notice how in the last 10 years, the mainstream media looks a lot like the social media algorithm that produces outrage. What's the way to get people to watch your Fox News show in the evening? You start out by showing a clip, and you show a clip of the left doing the worst thing possible, like Elon Omar. And so, who has run the Elon Omar clip more than anybody else? Not CNN, even though they produced it. It's Fox. It's the podcasters on the far right. They're playing that over and over and over again. And then what about on the other side? We've just had President Trump say that he hates his opponents. This was at the Kirk
At the
funeral.
memorial, yeah.
And he hates his opponents. And basically, he wants them to not do well, meaning basically people think he's threatening every Democrat in the country in that speech. Well, who is playing that over and over again? Not so much Fox News, it's CNN, MSNBC. The New York Times puts it up in bright lights. So, what you're seeing, Andre, is the transformation of the mainstream media to copy almost the algorithm of social media because they both want the same thing, eyeballs. They want people to watch. And what they're doing is producing outrage. They've got their standard operating procedures. All the media does the same thing. It's almost the same show. It's just you just flip the clips. You see what I mean? And I know because my job is to look and understand the different media. My job is not to just stay in a silo and
Mhm.
sit and crunch numbers. I've been when during the fall, I went to rallies, the Trump rallies, I went to the Harris rallies. It's like doing field research, Andre. So if you're going to go study what's happening in Lebanon, you go to Lebanon. You don't just sit back in an ivory tower at the University of Chicago. If you're going to go study what's going on in American politics that's producing violent populism, you better get out and actually go to those rallies and find out what is going on. It's the same thing. This is what we do. I mean, again, I don't mean to keep being a University of Chicago alum, but I don't see anybody else doing that. When I was at these rallies, I didn't meet all these other professors from all these other universities doing this.
Well, I mean, I think that's why everyone keeps calling you up to, do these podcasts, do these interviews, because you're actually on the ground, you're actually getting an in-depth look. Well, Professor Pape, I want to sort of go back to a previous point you made, because the points about the demographic transformation, the shift of wealth, to the top 1%, when you described all of that, and also your mention of Lebanon, by the way, that all reminds me of prelude to civil war. Am I over exaggerating with that fear?
Well, we have three long-term outcomes here, Andre. We have a civil war, which is a long-term outcome. We have a soft landing, which I still think is possible if we work toward it. You have a middle outcome, which is not civil war, but it is fragmentation. It is the country pulling itself apart here. And what happens in a country, if you think of the former Yugoslavia, for example, Yugoslavia did not have the Bosnian Civil War as the beginning of its political violence. Now, a lot of people they may only know about Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia, because of the civil war in Bosnia. But what happened is there's the decade of the 80s. And the decade of the 80s in Yugoslavia was the coming apart of Yugoslavia. And that then did lead, because nobody stopped it from coming apart. Okay.
Yeah.
So once it come apart, then that led to that war. And that's also what happened in our Civil War. Our Civil War did not start out with with an actual battle. It started out with secession here. So what we need to understand is that we're now in an era of violent populism. There are three future outcomes. I still believe we can achieve at least a medium soft landing. We've already had a lot of violence here. I don't believe these worst outcomes must happen here. But basically, by the way, we need a lot of more. So I need more research here to do this work in the next few years. This isn't like one and done. Yeah, I've been doing it for 5. We need a lot more here. And then also what we need to do is we need some near-term steps, Andre. So I do have big ideas here for how to really, sort of improve the whole trajectory we're on. But right now, we need something more in just the next few months. We need to understand that political leaders have a pretty big say in what can happen in our future. And let me just give an example here of what happened at the Kirk funeral. You had Erica Kirk,
Hmm.
who was the widow. And what did she do? She forgave the shooter. This is a profound moment. She's essentially offering an olive branch, which is basically to say, look, world, look, whole country, let's stop this right here and now. Okay. Then you had right after her, President Trump come on and say, I'm sorry, Erica. I do not forgive. I hate. Those are two different speeches back to back. And this is the choice we have. We can give the speech like Erica Kirk, which is how to hold the country together, the future of the country. By the way, the future of the country can still have Republican leaders. It doesn't mean Republicans don't get, I don't think Erica Kirk was thinking she's elected a Democrat. Okay. But you have Erica Kirk and you have the alternative here, which is a much more disastrous future. You can also look here on the Democratic side, and you can say there are leaders here that are trying to reach out to that middle. There are other leaders, not so much. And this is really the choice we have. And what we need to understand is the future is up to us. And we need to understand that we really need to go further. Now, one of the things I would like to do is I'd like to find a way to bring a Republican leader and a Democratic leader together to make a joint video statement, maybe at the University of Chicago. I've been pitching this idea for a long time, Andre, and Face the Nation. I was just on this big show,
Hmm.
and I was on the Sunday after Kirk was assassinated. Your listeners can go and find it. And they'll find that before I was there, and Face the Nation told me they were going to do this on the Friday before we did this, they said to me, Bob, we're going to do your idea. We're going to be the first ones ever to do that idea of a Republican Democrat. There were 2 senators, Langford and Coons, on Face the Nation at the exact same time, video side by side, condemning political violence. So this can happen. It's important. You saw Erica Kirk. We need more people out there willing to work to not work for the other party. We need people to understand that we really have a big job in front of us for that medium soft landing, which holds the country together. If we just throw this to the winds, if we just say, oh, sure, we're going to just ram the US military down Chicago's throat, okay? Well, our data from Chicago shows that's not very good, and published a big piece on that in the New York Times about the details. Not just, this isn't hand wavy opinion. This is rooted in data and rooted in a professor who's been calling, getting some correct calls here, not just talking after the fact. So we have choices as we go forward. And I think we need to understand that 70% of the country in our surveys wants no political violence. In fact, they abhor political violence, and they want Democratic and Republican leaders to jointly condemn it. That's 70% of Republicans and 70% of Democrats, roughly. So this isn't like there's no way forward here. There's a way forward. We've in our data, our surveys have been helping to diagnose, helping to clarify, and helping to point the way to unique solutions for what to do. And that's what the way forward here. And I believe we can get to a medium soft landing, but it's not going to happen on its own. And it's not going to happen if we just keep listening to the 15% on each side of the political spectrum, follow those extremes, and ignore the 70% in the middle. The 70% are who needs a leader now.
And I mean, Professor Pape, that's why I appreciate your research so much, because you're not only diagnosing the sickness and the infections, but you're actually trying to give us the medicine to actually solve these issues, to heal our wounded country. Professor Pape, thanks so much for joining me here today. I look forward to that piece you're going to be publishing fairly soon on the wealth transfer sort of factor.
That's coming in the fall, Andre.
Coming in the fall.
Yes. So I've got more pieces coming in foreign affairs. You just got an exclusive.
I am glad. I'll be pumping this out. So
Professor This is what I've ever, this is professor to student. You just got an exclusive. That will come out later in the book in the fall. So you just got the exclusive.
I appreciate that so much. But Professor Pape, thanks so much for joining me here today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Andre. And thanks to everybody watching.